We are in for a wild, wild ride, and ain't but 1% of the Western population aware, much less prepared, for what is on the horizon. Where do I begin trying to put all the pieces together for people today? Understand that there's a variety of different SHTF variables. They're all amplifying one another, and it's going to coalesce into a giant, inescapable shitstorm in the not-so-distant future. Let's begin. Should we begin with the evacuations, with the diplomats being expelled? Do we begin with the militaries moving towards the border? Do we begin with Nato crapping its pants? Let's go out even further. Because in order to understand what's going on right now, you really have to look at the big picture. Everything is interconnected, whether it's the Trump indictment, whether it's what's going on in Africa, what's going on between North Korea and the Russians, the Chinese, malware, the Poles, moving military equipment to the Belarusian border. It's all connected. The price of gold, the price of uranium skyrocketing, it's all connected. See, here's what's happening as far as I can see it. I'm no expert on this, but allow me to expound upon what I know for you. The American empire is about to contract. You see, and this is I must preface this by saying there's going to be that one guy, because 99.9% of you know what I'm about. I'm a free market guy. I'm pro-American. I love my American brothers and sisters. But there's going to be that one guy who misinterprets what I say. So I must preface this by saying that this is not an anti-American, anti-capitalistic rant. But I'm an objectivist. I'm a realist. So I got to keep it real. This is what is going on. The Pax American Empire and its vassal states, euphemistically termed NATO, are about to enter a period of contraction because they decided to engage in a attritional campaign against the Russians, who unfortunately for us are sitting on hundreds of trillions of dollars of resources that would allow them to fight this war for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what that means is that we must look elsewhere. And in our typical neo-colonial, multinational fashion, where we try to exploit and extort very impoverished countries and get cheap resources for pennies on the dollar, we look to Africa to meet our resource needs. Africa is incredibly critical for Europe right now, who was totally reliant on cheap Russian energy, which is no more. They cut that umbilical cord last year in the form of the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, France, highly reliant on uranium sources from other countries, one of which happens to be Nigeria, who provides 20% of the world's uranium. 20% is a lot. You got to look at these things when you're talking about a critical commodity. A 20% shortfall leads to civilizations burning themselves down. Okay, it's not just, oh, well, 20% of people aren't going to be able to heat their homes. It's when there's 20% shortfall in food, for example, the price of food does not go up correspondingly by 20%. No, it goes up by 4 or 5 or 10 times, because the people who are hungry are willing to pay whatever they need in order to get it. Thus, they bid the price up. Europe is reliant on cheap African resources. And right now there is an undercurrent, there always has been an undercurrent of anti-Western sentiment. This awareness that the debts that have been put on African countries, in many cases by choice, opting in, corrupt politicians, puppet governments who are being currently puppeted by their Western leaders, essentially. People are starting to resist this, and Nigeria was among one of those countries. Sudan was another. Burkina Faso is another. Countries who are starting to say, we don't want Western imperialism anymore. We are willing to forego the aid that you send us. We're willing to forego any sort of gains that we accrue through you developing our industrial sector. Of course, you extract the resources for much cheaper, so it's a very one-sided relationship in most cases. And some people might argue, look, you know, we all had to go through this developmental phase when we were industrializing. You got to eat it from the start. Maybe generations from now, you're in a more powerful bargaining position where you don't have to allow these multinational corporations to exploit you in the current way that they are. Maybe you get a better deal down the road. But the African countries are saying, you know what, yeah, this just isn't a very good deal. And they're starting to realize that Europe is highly reliant on what they have. Europe relies not only on uranium, but a lot of other things. Natural gas is a critical one. Crude oil is another. Gold, cotton, iron ore, coffee, grains, all sorts of things being exported on the cheap. And this was the plan all along. Europe looks to Africa in a bid to replace Russian natural gas. Well, what happens if Africa becomes destabilized? And make no mistake, the Russians aren't just some goody two-shoes saviors of the African peoples. They are out there for themselves as well. The Wagner Group, in a similar way, seeks to exploit and extort resources from Africa on behalf of their Russian oligarchical masters. So the Russians aren't exactly the good guy in this. In fact, a lot of people will reference this recent conference that took place where, you definitely have a lot of African countries leaning towards Russia right now and a lot of sympathy for the Russian cause there as a result of Russia doing some goodwill gestures of sending grain and providing some aid to these countries, as well as maybe showing them a bit more respect than the Ukrainians did when that African delegation went there with that peace proposal. And, the Poles searched the South African leader's plane and this whole embarrassing spectacle. Anyways, a lot of Africans are just saying, you know what, we're going to side with the Russians because it's the lesser of two evils. But they understand that it's a bunch of gangs trying to fight for territory there. That it's basically just a neo-colonial pursuit in some other form. In order for the American economy, which is built on a debt-based fiat system, to continually sustain itself, it must expand. Imperialism, we're still an imperialistic society. Again, I'm a pro-capitalist person, but I understand the finite limits of a resource, of our resources on this finite planet. And for that reason, ultimately, you come up against what are called limits, the limits of growth. All the low-hanging fruit gets picked, and you enter a phase of economic Malthusian-style contraction if your science and technological advances cannot make up for the shortfall in supply of resources. Then the demand is going to overwhelm that, and that excessive demand is going to destabilize the system, and, civil wars start and all that stuff happens. That's where we're at right now. And it's a scramble for Africa 2.0, essentially is what it is. Now, the majority of African leaders are on the take. They're in the back pockets. There's this organization, is it called ECOWAS, I believe? ECOWAS members. There's been a few countries which are suspended from it. There's countries that are resisting, like Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, I should say. And, of course, Niger, who is now not a member of ECOWAS. Well, the European Union, Nato, ECOWAS, they're all threatening Niger in basically any instability in the region that they will respond militarily. In fact, I believe it was France who today said that they will respond militarily to protect their interests. There are 2,500 NATO troops there, 1,500 of which are American, 1,000 of which are French. So this is a critical linchpin in the whole equation. If NATO wants to defeat Russia, they have to keep Africa on lock. If they can't do that, it's over. I mean, it's going to be a cold-ass winter when those nuclear power plants stop. You're going to have a lot of disgruntled people, and the last thing Macron needs is another riot. I mean, they're going to have one every year. Regardless, it's going to manifest in some form, whether it's yellow vests or disgruntled immigrants. It's going to come in some way, shape, or form, but they don't need two in 1 year, because that might be what tips the scales. So, yeah, the shit's hitting the fan, guys. The contraction is happening. Look at the price of uranium. Somebody knew what was coming, and this is why it's so important to pay attention to geopolitics. Because if you were a betting person and you knew what was about to happen in Africa, you could have invested in uranium companies right here. Cameco is one in my province. People in Saskatchewan are probably sitting there in the corner. Oh yeah, this is going to be good for us. Because this is the price of uranium, up nearly 25% in less than a month. That's pretty substantial, wouldn't you say? How much did your 401k go up last year? How long has it taken to get 25% gains? I'm assuming it was a lot longer than a month. And I presume that if the situation continues to get destabilized there, this is going to go up by a lot more. Because they need uranium right now. Russia is one of the primary providers of global uranium and enriched uranium, and it still baffles and boggles my mind that Russia is still sending enriched uranium to the United States of all places. I mean, and this is how you know that the only thing preventing nuclear war right now is globalization. The only thing preventing these nations from going at it full bore is that we're interconnected, we're interreliant, there's codependency amongst different nations, but that is ending, and it's ending fast. If Africa becomes destabilized, and if this contagion of resistance and this consciousness of African people who do not want to be under the boot heel of the West and are starting to reject these neo-colonial forms of subjugation, if this continues, even if they're not successful, even if it just creates instability, that's all you need. Russia wins. Russia wins big, and that means that NATO has to go back to the bargaining table, begging on their hands and knees to Russia, please, please, we'll rebuild the pipelines. We promise we won't rearm Ukraine. Well, actually, we really will. But you know, we just need that stuff that you got. We need that energy because our markets are in a state of recession and depression. And understand that this is the end of the line. There are a certain amount of commodities that are renewable, but a lot of this stuff is non-renewable. Our capitalistic system is approaching the limits of a finite planet. And I don't speak to that from a person who wants communism. It's just a reality that you cannot have a perpetual expanding gross domestic product on a finite planet forever. It has to come to an end at some point. Now, are we close to that end? I don't know. There's probably a lot of resources that we haven't discovered yet, but ultimately, you would think that the game has to end at some point, or it just has to contract and significantly contract so it can be built up again. This is how our system is currently operating, which is why, you know, going on a really weird cosmic tangent, unless we can start mining asteroids or other planets, I think we're pretty much screwed. We're destined to self-destruction. But that's another story altogether. What is going on in the world, my friends? I really don't know. I'm just a guy trying to figure it out. I'm a prepper. You see, I intuitively knew that the shit was going to hit the fan first. So I started the revolutionary act of trying to become more self-reliant first, before I even really knew all the minutiae of all the stuff that I talk about on a daily basis. I was a prepper before I was a geopolitical commentator, if you will. And to call myself a geopolitical commentator is to not call myself an expert, because like many of you, I will only now become a geographic expert on sub-Saharan Africa because of the current situation. I could not find Burkina Faso on a map before a week ago. So, full disclosure there, I am certainly not an expert, but boy, are we learning how these things, these systems are so interconnected, and that this is a 4D macroeconomic game. You cannot just look at these petty squabbles on the front line, and of course people's lives are not petty. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying you cannot look at this war in terms of battle by battle tactics. You have to look at the grand macroeconomic picture if you truly want to understand the bigger, larger war. This is why sanctions are the real war. The economic war is far more important. Putin realizes that building ties with African countries is far more important in the long term. And the United States government denies Russian involvement. Surprisingly, they're not blaming the Russians for this instability in Africa. But regardless, a lot of these African resistance fighters that are emerging are showing solidarity with the Russian cause. perhaps not surprisingly. So I would not put it past the Wagner Group for Russia to be in some way instigating this, if even by some online internet troll armies. I don't know how much of a foothold the internet has in Africa thus far, but I'm assuming that it's substantial, because I think there's more. There's more cellular adoption in Africa than in some developed countries in the world, so because they don't have landlines and stuff like that. So the internet is there. Do they have internet access, high speed? Probably not, but I'm certain that there's a social media campaign happening in some of these places. You can bet. So I guess we'll just have to see what happens. But that's it in a nutshell. That's it, guys. That's what's happening. We're on a finite planet. Our expanding economic system cannot expand anymore. And of course, here in the West, in North America in particular, we've been spoiled because of things that happened hundreds of years ago when this new land was discovered and we built our whole economic system around the principles of this never-ending expansionist monetary system, which of course ultimately was going to approach its limits, and now it is, and it of course creates conflict around the world. And all of these different variables in the SHTF equation are amplifying one another. It's all going to coalesce into a giant SHTF shitstorm, and you better have an umbrella and a good stockpile of food, ammo, and medical supplies when it goes down. In Belarus today, apparently 2 helicopters crossed a border, skirted the border, the Polish border, and the Poles, boy, are they capitalizing on this. They're saying that this was a provocation, and so they're moving a bunch of troops into the region. I think another 1,000 troops. Who knows how many troops are already in some of these border regions. It happened in this region here, which was right on the border near a place called, what is the place called? Blawa, I can't even pronounce it. I won't even try because I'm going to embarrass myself. I've already embarrassed myself enough on this channel. Bialawaza. Anyways, the Poles are saying, hey, this Wagner group digging these tunnels and trenches near the border, mining the border, we are highly sus of what's going on there. And it's no surprise they've putting HIMARS systems, they're installing anti-tank barricades, they're moving troops to the border. They're accusing the Belarusians, in fact, of using immigrants as saboteurs. If you look at some of these immigrants sitting on the border between Belarus and Poland, these guys look like they're pretty well fed. They're all very well clothed, and it is a little suspicious that maybe they're trying to use these immigrants to provoke the Polish authorities, or to possibly even do acts of sabotage within the country to undermine the Polish government there. It's very possible. A lot of these things are, stem from, what's the word I'm looking for? Paranoid. What's the word I'm looking for when you stereotype a group of people, when you pigeon? I can't even remember the word. My lexicon is contracting as I get older. But all I can say is that things are heating up on that front. And it's undeniable that we're seeing a repeat of what happened on the border between Ukraine and Russia, only it's happening on the Polish border with Belarus. So it's only a matter of time before we see something happen. Some small-scale skirmish or accident ensue there on the border. And the Polish Ministry of Defense is capitalizing on this opportunity. They capitalize on every opportunity they can to justify moving more troops towards the border. This is an interesting strategy. The Russians now have set up these anti-drone barricades for the Kerch Bridge, so the Ukrainians may not be successful in having any more attacks on the Kerch Bridge. They're putting these cope cages of sorts around the Kerch Bridge, but that's just another sidebar. So much stuff is going on today. We got more explosions in and around the Moscow region, this time in the industrial sector. This comes just 24 hours after the second attack on a skyscraper in Moscow. People in Moscow, residents there, are saying that they're preparing for war. They're aware that war is coming. They're not losing sleep over it yet. They're aware that it's just going to become a fact of life. Perhaps this incremental move in terms of Russia putting air defense systems on, in terms of promoting this lower grade of martial law upon the population in months gone by, has primed people to accept this in a more compliant manner. But the Russians are still very concerned about declaring war against Ukraine. They're not ready to do it yet. Again, Putin is a chess player. He understands the grand global economic strategy, and he's playing to that more so than he's playing to troops dying on the front lines because they are poorly equipped, even though we know that the Russians appear at least to be having an unlimited supply of very advanced weapon systems, but they're not engaging in another offensive just yet. You keep hearing all of these pro-Russian guys saying that the Russians are far and away winning this thing, that Ukraine's lost it, it's over. They've been saying that for over a year, yet Russia has not even initiated a new offensive, a major offensive yet. So if that was true, you would think that they would have the manpower and the resources to at least start taking the initiative as opposed to being on the defensive, which is typically what they're at right now. And that might seem crazy when you look at all the images of them bombarding the ports and stuff, but in terms of moving their army, their ground forces further into Ukrainian territory, it hasn't really happened in many, many months. It has in small amounts in certain places, but not of a significant amount. So that shows you that they're concerned. Yes, they have a superior nuclear force. The Russian nuclear forces, we've interviewed numerous experts. If you're new to this channel, then you have to know that, yes, if we engage in a nuclear war with Russia right now, we would probably lose. They have superior nuclear, I don't want to say nuclear submarine technology, but they have some drone capabilities that are superior that we have no parity for in our military. They have, what do they have? They have the Sarmat missile system. It's been a long time since I've even talked about this on the channel, which can go around our defense systems. They have mobile ICBM platforms. They have EMP weapons. They have a larger stockpile of tactical nukes. They have a huge advantage in terms of their anti-ballistic missile capability. So if we were to engage with the nuclear war and the Russians, Moscow would be wiped out. But they also have a general culture of preparedness, which might be more resilient to nuclear war. I mean, turn on the trending page on YouTube and look at that for 5 seconds, and you tell me if we're prepared to engage in a hot war with the Russians. I'm going out into the woods. That's all I can say. In fact, we've been releasing a few videos lately about that. You should go and check them out, and we're going to have a lot more along those lines on this channel. This is not just an information channel. I could just sit here and do this every single day and talk and talk and talk and talk. But there's a part of me that doesn't feel right about just doing that. I feel as though I need to be providing you with practical information, interviewing guests, interviewing experts that are going to teach us how to become better prepared for this economic contraction, this inevitable contraction. This isn't just the ramblings of a prepper, okay? There are people who are far more intellectually astute than I am, who are able to lay this out in a very nuanced, articulate manner, way better than I ever could. Okay, and we're going to be hopefully getting some of those people on the channel to break it all down. They don't all agree on every single thing. As I said yesterday, principally what is happening is that we're entering the era of resource scarcity, and that manifests as a variety of different conflicts. It manifests in identity politics conflicts. It manifests in these wars that we're seeing between East and West. It manifests as ideological differences, religious differences, and just disagreements about this, that, and everything, when at the end of the day, what everybody's pissed off about is that their life is less fulfilling and they're paying more and more for it. That's what it boils down to. The era of cheap shit is coming to an end, and Africa is starting to realize their worth. It is what it is. The market valuations are sky high. We are approaching, once again, record bull market valuations. The Shiller PE ratio is about to get back to where it was after that post-pandemic crack-up boom that we had, where everybody was just throwing their money into the stock market. And I'm not sure why this is. Actually, I have my suspicions. I think it has something to do with the fact that just like the uranium scarcity, as resources become more scarce, or maybe not always more scarce, but it's in places which are unstable, the low-hanging fruit has been picked, you need more sophisticated methods of extracting these resources. I think that contributes to a general increased valuation of certain commodities, which is reflected in the stock market. Now, that doesn't mean that the economy as a whole is doing well and that people are not struggling to get by desperately. I cannot understand or fathom how people are happy in a lot of these human hives we call cities nowadays, working 3 weeks, probably 29 days out of a 31-day month, just to meet all your expenses, to pay all your taxes, and to live a substandard life compared to your predecessors. I don't understand how people aren't losing their minds. Oh wait, they are losing their minds. It all makes sense now. Anyways, according to Mr. Peter Schiff, we'll have to get him back on the channel. JP Morgan projects record gold prices in 2024, blah, blah, blah. What else is new? Yeah, the sea surface temperature is approaching new records. Everything, record this, record that. We're in the age of consequences, guys. That's all it is. It's a disequilibrium. It's not so much that... Yeah, never mind. Why even go there? Let's just let's keep it down to earth. Let's keep it focused on practical things people can sink their teeth into. So, France has threatened an intractable response to this coup that has happened in Niger if their interests are threatened. Imagine that, threatening another country, with militarily, because your interests are in that country. I can't think of a good comparison right now. Maybe somebody else can in the comment section below. But the shit's going to hit the fan. Niger has some of the world's largest deposits of uranium, platinum, cobalt, diamonds, and rare earth metals. EU depends on all this stuff. And I would recommend, and I think Zelensky even advised Ukrainian citizens that you need to stockpile firewood. You need to get prepared because it could be a very long winter in Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine, I believe, was at one point a net exporter of energy, nuclear energy, into Europe, if I'm not mistaken. I know they exported natural gas, petroleum-based energy. I'm pretty sure they actually exported some of that nuclear power as well, which of course has been compromised at Zaporozhye. The largest nuclear power plant in Europe is now basically just a bargaining tool in this war. We have Nato devising a plan if Zelensky gets erased. Interesting. Very interesting that they're talking about this. Meanwhile, they're claiming that Ukraine has this in the bag. See, both sides are just full of bluster right now. I should probably talk again a bit about the Gonzalo Lira situation. Hopefully, he's granted some measure of clemency in the country that he's trying to evacuate into. I believe it's Hungary, where he's trying to seek asylum right now. But it's not looking good because he made a video yesterday. Actually, let me back it up a bit. Some of you are probably wondering, who the hell is this Gonzalo Lira guy? Well, if you've been on the internet long enough, I believe he started off as Coach Red Pill. Then he went to Gonzalo Lira. He's debated all the, the destinies, and he's been on all the, Fresh and Fit, and he's been around the block on YouTube, okay? He's fairly well known in these YouTube niche areas. Anyways, he's a Chilean journalist who was in Ukraine when the war started, and he was very vocal in his condemnation of the Ukrainian government. He had a lot of scathing critiques, to say the least, of Zelensky and his regime and his supporters within Washington, one of which was Victoria Nuland, who apparently, according to him, is aware of his situation and is possibly why he has not been granted, what do they call it, extradition, or why he has not been allowed to leave the country and go back to the United States and was held in a facility, a jail cell there in Ukraine. Anyways, he recently was released a month ago. And he made a series of 3 videos yesterday documenting the fact that he was going to try to escape across the border into Hungary. Now, he said something interesting, because intuitively I thought, well, why don't you just go to Russia? If you have such a pro-Russian perspective, clearly the Russians are going to accept you. But he said something that I should have thought about, but I didn't think about, that the whole border is mined. And that if he were to try to just strut over, I mean, this seems obvious now when I think about it, but it's not like you can just walk across waving a white flag. You know, the border's mined. There's a high risk that you'll be either shot by the Ukrainians or by the Russians. So he can't go there. For the same reason, he can't go to Belarus. He obviously can't go to Moldova, Romania. Poland's a no-go zone, obviously. So the only hope he has is Hungary. You have Viktor Orban, who's been one of the people within NATO who's been a bit more sympathetic to the Russian cause. So he figured he would go there. And I guess we'll see what happens. We haven't heard from him. It's been over 12 hours, and he hasn't said anything yet. He said, if you don't hear from me in 12 hours, there's a good chance I'm probably in jail. His court date was for Wednesday, and he was pretty certain that if he was prosecuted, that he would be looking at 5 to 10 years in some kind of working prison camp. Of which he was certain that he would not be able to endure, and likely it would see him through his final days. So the lesson learned from this situation is something I've said from the start. I don't think anybody should ever self-censor per se, but there are ways to finesse and massage your viewpoint in a way which is acceptable. You don't throw stones when you're in a glass house. You don't criticize a regime that you're currently under when the country is in a war with the second largest, country on earth that has nuclear weapons. I mean, that should just go without saying, that you gotta watch what you say, okay? And as smart of a guy as Gonzalo is, he's a writer, he's incredibly articulate, he's also very emotional as well at times, which I won't fault him for, because that's, when you're a creative person, that's that par for the course. But I will say that he made a mistake in being so vocal in his opposition. He didn't need to be as explicit. He could have easily vacated the country. There was nothing preventing him from doing so, and then he could have voiced his concerns. He was an independently wealthy person. He could have afforded to do that if he so chose, but he didn't. He decided to stay there and run his mouth, and that is what happened. So do I think that it's inconsistent with the values of democracy that Ukraine claims to represent, to be representing on behalf of the West? Absolutely. Do I think that he should be free to voice his opinion? Absolutely. But we're not in a war zone. We're not under a state of martial law where the Ukrainians are suspecting everyone and everything of being a saboteur, as they probably have to do. So you have to look at it from both sides. If I was the Ukrainians, I would have just expelled him to the United States. But maybe there's forces within the United States that don't particularly like the guy and are just doing this out of spite. Regardless, that's the lesson learned. There is always a way to get your point across. In fact, what's his name? Dr. John Campbell is a great example of that. And I knew this throughout the entire pandemic. Most people don't realize that I never took the thing. Okay, I never took it. And I probably just, boom, shot myself in the foot, didn't I? With this video. Let's start it all over again. Hell with that, I'm not going to do it. I had to purchase every 3 days papers that said that I was free and clear, that I tested negative. Every single 3 days, it cost me around $100 every 3 days in order to do that. I did that for a year. It cost me a lot of money to do that so I can participate in society, continue to go to the gym. I obeyed all the rules. I wore the mask. I did all those things, okay? And throughout this whole thing, the reason why I was so tight-lipped about this, well, for obvious reasons. We all know, I mean, come on, we all know what's going on now, right? But at the time, you have to be very measured and very careful with what you say and how you present these things, unless you just want to shoot yourself in the foot. You can't throw stones in a glass house. But Dr. John Campbell has done it differently than a lot of people who came out guns blazing. It's very similar to getting into a protest. If you're going to protest, there's a way to do it intelligently, and there's a way to be an idiot about it. You can start throwing rocks at the police. who clearly have overwhelming force against you see what's going to happen. You know what the end result is going to be. It's like, well, why did they lock me up and put me in the paddy wagon? Well, you knew that what you were saying was going to get you there. You knew that what you were saying was going to get you demonetized and deplatformed. So you have to do it in such a way which is more intelligent. And Dr. John Campbell showed us how you can do that and maintain your credibility and even be brought onto some mainstream media sources. They gave him a chance. When they realized, okay, this guy's starting to push back a little bit, then they kind of edged him out. Okay, they've seen him as a fringe fellow now. But where am I going with it? Why the hell did I get on this topic? I can't even remember what I was talking about. Oh, geez. I don't even know how this became about me not getting the jab. Guys, I mean, it's all interconnected, right? It's all interconnected. It's about control. It's about capitalizing on opportunities. And as the contraction continues, the intersect between conflict, climate, and contagion is going to continue to amplify the other. So all of these variables continue to amplify. This is all still related to what happened during the pandemic. Everything was just kind of brought out. I mean, you could say that all of these events, were written in the stars, so to speak, because the Wuhan lab thing wouldn't have happened if, there wasn't some sort of oversight or greed at some level of the system, some inherent flaw in our economic model, which allowed these things to manifest in the first place. The East versus West conflict, how that factors in, and how all of these things fan the flame of everything else. So all I'm saying is that you probably should continue to do what you're doing, continue to live your life, love your life, prepare. I'm never saying that it's the end is nigh, we gotta be fatalistic about our future. I'm never suggesting that you do anything stupid, you do anything crazy, you think that the end is nigh, so you go and you self-harm or something like that. Look, nothing is guaranteed, okay? It may very well be that we are all faced with a challenge someday, which is going to be possibly insurmountable. But regardless, it is our duty as human beings, I believe, to fight till the bitter end, if and when that day comes. If the worst case scenario unfolds, you are obligated. Your ancestors struggled, okay? They were struggling to make fires out there so you could be so lucky to get here at this point in time. And the worst thing that you have to worry about is nuclear Armageddon. Come on. I would take nuclear Armageddon over a saber-toothed tiger, all right? I'm just saying. So these problems, I do believe, even if the worst case unfolds, there's a chance. There's always a chance. Is it going to be easy? No, but nothing is guaranteed. We could go years, decades without any major event happening. It's looking as though it's going to come a lot sooner than that, because there comes a certain point, an inflection point almost, where the compounding nature of these crises, there's just an event that emerges very quickly. It's like nothing happens, and all of a sudden, everything happens. What's that old saying that I've said before on the channel? For decades, days happen, and then in days, decades happen. So, or is it in decades, nothing happens, and then in days, decades happen? Something to that effect. I think you catch my drift, but it appears as though this is where we're at right now. Enough of the lecture. Is there anything else I missed? Oh yeah. On a more practical note, China has replaced 2 of its elite nuclear chiefs. They're trying to consolidate power within the PLA under their new nuclear doctrine, their new nuclear strategy. They want to become, if they're not already, a global nuclear superpower. I mean, we know they already are a global nuclear superpower. The experts I've spoken to indicate that their nuclear stockpiles are far larger than they disclose, and this should be obvious because they're not bound by any sort of nuclear agreements like the Russians and the Americans had. So the Chinese industrial machine, a lot of people are naive to its capabilities. You have a lot of people like Peter Zion who think that the Chinese are in a state of techno-arrested development of sorts, that Yeah, they can build a lot of cheap Walmart products, but they don't have the ability to build sophisticated things like iPhones. Oh, wait, no, they build all the iPhones. That's right. That they don't have the ability to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles and satellites and space stations. Oh, right, they do all that too. So I'm guessing that the Chinese, at the flick of a switch, can say, all right, we're not going to build any more shit for Walmart. We're going to convert all of our industrial base into building military equipment. And overnight, they could probably assemble as big of an army as they wanted to. I mean, think about that society for a second. Have you seen... I've never been to China, but I've seen videos of some of these cities, their collectivist mindset, their self-sacrificing mindset. I mean, if these guys wanted to create a impenetrable, invincible military, they probably could. I mean, there's going to be people here saying, well, yeah, but they don't have the military experience, and point taken. But when you have an army which is 10 times the size of your adversaries, does it really matter at that point? What we're learning in this Russia-Ukraine conflict, at the end of the day, it just comes down to good old-fashioned artillery. There's nothing special about these fancy weapons. There's ways to get around them. There's electronic warfare. There's hacking, and the Chinese are proficient at these things. They're a high IQ population with incredible capabilities. It's very likely that indeed this hack job on the critical infrastructure of the United States and the military is worse than they're making out. We've been talking about the dormant malware that's sitting on American military and critical infrastructural systems for a couple years now. And basically what they're going to do is, if the hybrid war, the war between China and the United States, starts in the proxy of Taiwan, they're going to start flicking switches. And you're going to start to see grid down situations. You're going to start to see telecommunications go down. You're going to start to see waterworks system be compromised, gas pipeline explosions. You're going to start to see the entirety of our grid get touched in some way, shape, or form by the underlying cyber war. And if you don't think that the Chinese can muster the population, if you don't think they have armies of people who are ready at a moment's notice to engage in this massive cyber war, then you've been smoking something, and maybe that's what the government wants. Maybe they want you to keep smoking that stuff so you don't realize what's going on. And I would encourage you to put it down and get ready, because you'll be happy you did when you have no other choice. I think I've been rambling on long enough. Is there anything I haven't spoken about today? I talked about the price of uranium skyrocketing. I think I did. You might want to invest in Cameco. I talked about Trump being indicted over the Capitol riot. What is the outcome of that going to be? Probably civil war. Is it all just a distraction to keep people occupied mentally while the world burns around us and the economic contraction ensues? Because it is a divide and conquer situation. You know, if we're reaching a point that's untenable and there's no resolution to the global issue and the decoupling, and the West is now just in a period of contraction, you might as well get the people fighting over petty political domestic squabbles in order to keep them away from understanding what is truly going on and panicking. I think that's about it. Oh yeah,